Hey guys and gals, I got another one for you today. Today is going to be the fourth video of the What I Wish I Knew When I First Started Tanking series. Today we're going to piggyback off the last video a bit by helping talk about styles of tanks within each tank type. About tiers 5 and 6, the different tank types really start to take shape, along with the styles within each type. The rules in this video are a little extended because this material is broad and cannot be sorted to such finite details. Let's begin. Rule number 1. Heavy tanks can be sorted into 3 different styles: frontline, support, and flanking heavies. Frontline heavies are heavily armored, usually slower. That's not always the case. Supporters have good armor, but more glaring weak points, and generally are more mobile than the frontliners. Flankers utilize their mobility, usually sacrificing armor, and can be thought of as a close range sniping style, utilizing terrain to cover their armor weaknesses and maximize their DPM. Rule number 2, light tanks. Light tanks can be sorted into different styles. However, before I jump into that, most scouts can do all of the following, just that some do each better than others: spotters, snipers, supporters, and floaters. Floaters are going to be quote-unquote all-arounders that can generally fulfill all 3 roles well. Spotters usually have good camo to vision ratio complemented by good speed. Snipers can stay hidden while shooting, a combo of good camo, gun depression, and accuracy. Supporters have a good mobility to gun ratio, either DPM or high alpha. Rule number 3, tank destroyers. Tank destroyers can be sorted into 2 main categories: assault tanks and snipers. Assaulters are going to be slower, well armored, whereas snipers or glass cannons generally have great firepower, mobility, and or camo. Rule number 4. Artillery is what it is, and though some nations differ, there isn't much to it, and I won't be spending a long time on them. However, I do recommend you go down a line of artillery so you understand what it's like, and it'll help you protect yourself from sky poop. Rule number 5, medium tanks. I save this class for last because they're generally the most flexible and can fill the 4 main styles we talked about in the last video: brawler, sniper, scout, and supporter. Like scout tanks, most mediums can fulfill all the following roles. They each have strengths and weaknesses that they lean towards: floaters, snipers, flankers, and supporters. Floaters are great, again, all-arounders, and don't really have a downside. Think of Mario of Mario Kart. Snipers, packing accurate guns, good to great mobility and lack of armor. Camo is a bonus, but not always apparent. Flankers, having good mobility to put themselves in great locations and allowing them to fall back when their position is compromised. These usually pack burst damage and speed. Supporters, going to be packing more armor and also known as heavyums, usually have good guns, workable armor, but are lacking speed. That's about the shortest version of the different tank types as I could generalize them into. This is no easy way to cram them into such a short period, but if it was understood and fulfill what you were looking for, then I'll catch you in the next video. If you're hungry for more in-depth details to help you decide what lines you want to go down, then let's get to it. Couple of things before I begin the details. Firstly, I hate categorizing tanks because I don't want the misconception that you must play certain tanks certain ways. In fact, being able to experiment with the many different tanks on the different maps with the different teams are one of my favorite things about this game. However, if all my or your teams followed these details to a T, I think you and I would have around at least a 70% win rate, the 30% being RNG and different player skills and experience. Next, I talked about how the types start to take shape at tiers 5 and 6, and these videos are pointed towards newer players. I apologize for using tier 10s to compare the separate types, really because newer players won't have their hands on these tanks. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. First, though they start the transformation at tiers 5 and 6, they really become specialists at tier 10, and the comparisons are more apparent and easier to decipher. The next reason is because I don't own every tank, but almost every tier 10. Although this may be helpful to newer players as they start to find themselves enjoying certain styles, then they can see these tanks and know what lines they may want to go down. Alright, so let's jump into it. Let's begin with heavy tanks. Before I talk about the different types and talk more in depth about the differences, let's just talk about heavies in general. Heavy tanks should be in or close to the choke. And to me, more importantly than being in and winning the choke, is not proceeding out into the open like a puddle pirate, thinking that you just won the game. A lot of the times you'll see your heavies, they'll win the choke, and then they'll proceed out into the field that's usually, or the open space past the choke, and then they're all dead. It's because they're getting farmed by the mediums, tank destroyers, and arties. They're just waiting for them to come out of that choke. Alright, frontliners, much like the mouse, which I have on the screen. Frontliners need to be taking point until their hit points have dwindled, and then you can be taking a secondary line or falling back to defend the base. And really, when it goes to defending the base in a frontline heavy tank, you dig in and you get in a nice sniping position. Frontliners shouldn't be alone since they lack mobility and reload times, which leaves them vulnerable to flanking. Utilize their armor and lack of weak points. Understand your weak points and knowing how to hide them or limit the exposure to the opponents. High damage games are not your priority. They're just a bonus. Soaking up bullets to allow your softer teammates to make the enemies pay should be your priority. Supporters, like the E5, have workable armor, but have more glaring weak points than the frontliners. Small movements, wiggling, and or angling will help in all your tanks, but most effective in your support heavies. Put yourself in second line support to your frontliners. Keep them from being flanked and punish the opponents for overextending to attempting penetrations on your teammates. You're more mobile than your frontliners, so when and if the enemy frontliners are vulnerable, either they have low HP or they have little to no support, utilize your mobility to open up a crossfire on them to expose their weak points. You should be trying to keep your hit points, but using them appropriately to gain position to keep your heavies alive when necessary. Flankers, like the AMX-50B, you give up your armor for mobility, although you still generally have effective armor and more hit points to play with to gain position or being able to trade more effectively than other tank types. To me, this is one of the trickiest heavies to be most effective in. Positioning, awareness, and timing are of the utmost importance, and errors are not forgiven in this tank, where the other heavies generally are more forgiving. I talked about the sniper style, utilizing mobility and terrain to stay hidden and keeping your gun in the game. And these are close range snipers, setting up on flanks, waiting for enemies to be drawn away and punished while the enemy's reloading. And really just being able to trade effectively in these tanks. Light tanks. First and foremost, importantly, you keep your camo values while moving in light tanks, so you can move around the battlefield safer than anyone else on your team. Firing your gun will remove your camo values, so damage should be secondary to your assisted damage. Vision and intel need to be a priority over your own damage. With this said, you're the most influential piece to your team. You can gather intel for your team and figure out enemy deployment. Control the vision through the middle and play cleanup at the end of the battle. You have the least amount of hit points, so try to conserve them for effective trading in endgame. Don't be a puddle pirate and go to the choke, leaving the rest of the map exposed to enemy lights that will expose your team. Spotters fall into two classes. Passive spotters usually have high mobility and amazing vision to camo profiles, hiding in bushes, staying dangerously close to enemy tanks to provide intel throughout the game. Active spotters, lower acceleration, good speed, but are lacking camo values. Utilize mobility, terrain, and intel to keep the enemies lit. Stopping will make you a big target. Snipers can stay hidden while shooting, initializing terrain to minimize their exposure. So good to decent gun depression is a plus. Supporters lack mobility and vision to camo compared to the other scouts, so they can still and need to be providing intel and vision. They cannot be as aggressive in open spaces as other scouts can. And finally, out of these five, the T-Light to me is the best all-around scout in the game and can fulfill any of these roles which you so choose to seek. Tank destroyers. In a tank destroyer, you can affect how quickly the match is over. If you ever feel like you're getting raffle stomped, pay attention to the differences between your tank destroyers compared to the enemy tank destroyers. Theirs are probably pushing up and keeping their guns active. I feel this is the class that is misplayed the most because of the quote-unquote sniper profile it's given. If you can't see your frontline tanks, then you're not in a helpful position. If and when they are flanked, you need to be able to see them so you can effectively help them and keep them alive. Don't be the puddle pirate tank destroyer player sitting in the back and waiting for your team to die before you get your gun in the game. And though that may lead to some epic comebacks, it is not great teamwork and is not a sustainable way to maintain your win rate or damage standing. Not all tank destroyers are snipers. If you have armor, use it. Tank destroyers usually have high penetration or high penetration and alpha damage, or good accuracy and low alpha. Like frontline heavies, front-facing tank destroyers should never be overextending in battle since they can easily be flanked. And for God's sake, if you're fighting a forward-facing tank destroyer, track it and then get to one of the three sides that doesn't have a gun pointing at you. So assaulters, like the T110E3 on the screen. Assaulters have good effective armor and good guns. Gameplay should mimic support heavies and frontliners when given the right opportunity. Snipers, like the Sturv 103B, should be played much like sniping scouts, utilizing mobility and terrain to put yourself in great long to medium range support. Generally, glass cannons that depend on their concealment, utilizing cover, gun depression, or camo to be successful. Arty. Many people have a misconception that Arty is a mindless class that a noob can play and be successful in. Yes, against popular opinion, I highly disagree. I can feel the difference between a great Arty player on my team and a casual Arty player on my team. Yes, RNG is still the big balancer of this class. However, there are things to maximize your effectiveness on the battlefield in this class. Now, I'm not the best arty player, but I feel I'm above average. And I have and continue to learn tactics and locations in my artillery from tapping into players that do well with them. Map location is key. Also moving with the pace of the game. And finally, map awareness. To me, those are the biggest things to take away here. If you have those three pieces, you'll be at least as good as I am in artillery. Then there's finding flat ground to limit your gun dispersion and taking elevations to account. Think of it as golf. If your target is below you, normally your shot is going to sail along with the arc. And if they're elevated above you, then your shell will generally fall short. So keep that in mind. Don't be the puddle pirate arty that spams the no shot communication. Your tank has tracks. Anticipate your movement to be able to support your tanks throughout the whole battle as they advance. Also, don't be the puddle pirate arty that stays on spawn when only 2 tanks go down the opposite side of the lemmings on your team. Chances are you're just going to die and you're not going to be able to help. Mediums. Mediums are the most unforgiving and inconsistent, but most rewarding type of tank that you can have and master. Usually they can fill any role on the battlefield, maybe besides brawling. Some have strengths over others, and it's hard to categorize each medium tank into a specialty tank type. Keeping your gun active, conserving your hit points for game-breaking decisions, and being flexible on the battlefield will help your stats and help your teams. If I do have to categorize them, it's going to be floaters, snipers, flankers, and supporters. And honestly, I've covered all 4 of these in the other types of tanks. So if you want, you can go back through and figure out what those are. Hopefully I explain them well enough that you can understand them. Once again, it's going to be floaters, snipers, flankers, and supporters, and they should be understood by the previous classes that I talked about with the alike names. Finally, I'd like to generalize nations for each classes to maybe help you out if you think you know what class style you like, but you're not certain which lines fulfill that need. So for heavy tanks, your frontliners are going to be German, Soviet, Japanese, and Polish tanks. Your supporters are going to be American, British, and Chinese. Your flankers are going to be French and Swedish. Scouts, your active spotters are really going to be the Americans and Soviets. The passive spotters are going to be French and Soviets. Sniping is going to be German and French. Supports are going to be Chinese and Soviet. Tank destroyers. These are really not prioritized by nations, since nations with tank destroyers usually have a heavy TD line and a sniping TD line. Only specialized nations would be Swedish with their sniping tank destroyer line, and then the Chinese tank destroyers that start as sniping TDs and then around tier 8 to 10 transform into great assault TDs. Arty, I just recommend new players to start American or French lines, then maybe British, and then German and Soviets pulling up the rear, which are fun at low tier, but they get to be quite tricky when their gun traverse and lack of mobility, I guess, falls away as you get into the higher parts of those tech trees. Mediums, once again, are the most flexible class, but if I have to send you down a certain nation, your floating mediums are going to be Soviets, Chinese. Your sniping mediums are generally going to be Germans, French. Flankers will be French, Czech. Supporters are going to be American, Soviet, Chinese. All right. That's a 20-minute video. I apologize this took so long. But it's just a lot to talk about, a lot to cover. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this helps. And make sure you like, share, subscribe, and I will catch you in the next video.